A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, but his new assistant changed everything. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're reading from. Now, enjoy part 1. The atmosphere at Brooks and Lane Industries was unusually tense that Monday morning. The usual click of heels and shuffle of papers were drowned out by hushed whispers. Eyes darted toward the executive wing with a strange mix of pity and anticipation. "Did you hear?" whispered a junior assistant near the coffee machine. "About the new hire?" another replied, glancing around. "She starts today." "She doesn't know about the rule, does she?" "Not a clue. This'll be a train wreck." The rule was legendary. Ethan Brooks, the reclusive billionaire CEO of Brooks and Lane, had a strict policy. No physical contact with women, no handshakes, no polite pats on the back, not even an accidental brush in a crowded hallway. For over 2 decades, every female employee had adapted. Some chalked it up to billionaire eccentricity, others speculated about a traumatic past. But one thing was clear: no one dared break it. No one except Rachel Miller, his brand new executive assistant, who hadn't been warned. Rachel arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a navy blouse and crisp black slacks, her resume neatly filed in her leather folder. The moment she stepped into the office, she felt it. The eyes, the whispers, the tension. But she brushed it off. First day jitters, maybe. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. "Rachel," said Emma Carter, the executive secretary, "Mr. Brooks needs a tie. There's a meeting in 15 minutes. Go to the executive wardrobe and bring him one." Rachel blinked. "A tie? Just grab one?" "Yes, now." She hurried to the wardrobe, an oak-paneled closet lined with perfectly pressed ties in every color imaginable. She stood frozen. "There's like 50 of these," she muttered. "Okay. What tie says emotionally unavailable CEO? Navy? Too friendly? Black? Too funeral? Burgundy? Trying too hard? Screw it." She grabbed them all. Moments later, she knocked on the CEO's office door. "Come in," said a low, clipped voice. She pushed the door open to find Ethan Brooks standing behind his massive mahogany desk, adjusting the cuffs of a stark white shirt. He looked exactly how a man who hadn't smiled since the early 2000s would look. Stoic, sharp-jawed, ice in human form. He turned toward her and froze. "What is that?" "Ties," she said, stepping forward. "All of them. I wasn't sure which one you preferred." Ethan stared at the pile draped over her arms. "Give me one." Rachel dumped them on the desk and, without thinking, grabbed a patterned one and handed it to him. He raised an eyebrow. She glanced down. Tiny, yellow, rubber ducks. "Oh my God. Wait, not that one." She snatched it back and grabbed a solid navy tie. "Here, sorry." He took it with a curt nod. "That'll do." Relieved, she turned to leave, until she glanced back and saw him completely ruining the tie. Rachel's eyebrows furrowed. "Wait, you're doing it wrong." "I'm not. No, seriously. That knot is a crime. Just let me fix it." She stepped forward instinctively and lifted her hands to his collar. Her fingers brushed the skin of his neck. In a split second, his entire body went rigid. Rachel paused. "Sorry, I just..." But he stepped back violently, nearly hitting the edge of his desk. "You touched me." She blinked. "I was just fixing your..." "Don't ever do that again." Rachel frowned. "Okay, chill. I'm not radioactive." "You don't understand," he said, voice clipped, like he was holding something in. "Then make me understand. Because right now you're acting like I zapped you with lightning." "I can't be touched," he said. The words sounded like a confession, like a curse. She hesitated. "Do you, like, melt or turn into a frog?" "This isn't a joke." She backed off, hands raised. "Fine. I won't touch you again." "Good. Great. I'll just go then." "You should." Rachel rolled her eyes and walked out. The moment the door shut behind her, Ethan exhaled and pressed his fingers against the spot on his neck where her hand had been. He didn't feel disgusted. He didn't feel panicked. He felt something else. And that was a problem. Out in the bullpen, Rachel returned to her desk, cheeks still flushed. Max Caldwell, the head of finance, appeared with his usual coffee and lazy grin. "So, you survived." "Barely," she muttered. "No one touches Ethan," Max said, sipping his drink. "Ever." "Well, it would have been nice to know that before he flinched, like I stabbed him with a letter opener." "You actually touched him?" "I was just fixing his tie. It was painful to watch." Max gave a low whistle. "Congratulations. You just broke a 20-year streak," Rachel groaned. "I should have stayed in bed." Meanwhile, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a spreadsheet he wasn't reading. His tie was now perfectly tied, thanks to her. His pulse still hadn't slowed. And for the first time in 2 decades, someone had touched him. And he hadn't wanted to pull away. That alone terrified him more than anything in the business world ever had. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, Rachel Miller had just become a variable he could no longer ignore. A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, until his new assistant shattered his most sacred rule. Before we jump in, don't forget to comment below and let us know what you think about Rachel so far. Now, enjoy part 2. Ethan Brooks couldn't concentrate. His monitor glowed with charts and numbers, but nothing registered. The investor report might as well have been in a different language. His jaw was tense, his fingers tapped against his desk, and his mind was somewhere else entirely. He could still feel her fingers. It had only been a moment, maybe a second at most, but it had lingered far too long in his memory. Rachel Miller had touched him. Not by accident, not in passing. She had willingly stepped into his personal space and laid her hands on him without hesitation. And his world hadn't collapsed. No nausea, no panic, no urge to flee the room. It was wrong, all of it. Dangerous, confusing. He needed answers. 2 hours later, he pressed the intercom button. "Emma, send Rachel in. Have her bring the investor briefing." A pause, then, "Yes, sir." Out in the hallway, Rachel sat frozen for a second, clutching the report she'd just finished proofreading. Again? She knocked lightly and stepped inside. Ethan stood by the window, back straight, posture crisp, the usual fortress of detachment. "Here's the report," she said, walking up to his desk and holding it out. He turned, met her eyes for a moment, and reached for the folder. As their fingers brushed, something happened again. Rachel felt it, just a flicker, but she saw the shift in his posture. Subtle, controlled, but definitely there. His fingers tensed, the breath caught in his throat. And then, in his haste, a page slipped free and fluttered to the floor. "Damn it," he muttered. Rachel bent to pick it up at the same time he did. Their foreheads bumped lightly. She looked up, inches from his face. "Okay," she said with a smirk. "If this is another test of my reflexes, you might want to reconsider your methods." He stood quickly. Too quickly. "That wasn't—" He cleared his throat. "Just give me the report." She handed it over, watching him carefully. "Are you always this tense?" she asked. "I don't get tense." "Sure," she said, crossing her arms. "That's why you just dodged me like I was swinging a frying pan." His jaw clenched. "This isn't a game, Rachel." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not the one turning paperwork into combat training." His glare deepened, but Rachel didn't flinch. "Look, I get it. You don't like to be touched. Fine. But maybe warn people next time before you act like they've committed a federal crime." There was silence. Then, curtly, "You can go." Rachel turned without another word, but before she left, she muttered, "You know, for someone who controls billions, you're surprisingly bad at controlling yourself." The door clicked shut. Ethan exhaled and sat heavily in his chair. His hands were still trembling. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd built walls, routines, boundaries. They'd worked for 20 years. Now, in the span of one morning, one woman had cracked the system. And the worst part? He didn't want to rebuild it. The rest of the day blurred into a haze of meetings and reports. He tried to bury himself in numbers, but she was everywhere. Every time she passed his office, every time he heard her laugh across the floor with Max Caldwell, every time her name flashed on a document, she was under his skin, and it infuriated him. Later that afternoon, he found a minor formatting error in her report, the kind of mistake he'd usually overlook. This time he didn't. He pressed the intercom. "Rachel, my office, now." "Right now?" "Yes." 2 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "If this is about that one pixel that didn't align, I swear..." He held up the report. "Explain this." She glanced at it and immediately spotted the misaligned table. "Okay, fair, but be honest. Did you really call me in here for that?" "I expect precision." "You expect silence and spreadsheets. But newsflash, people aren't perfect. Even you." He didn't respond. She narrowed her eyes. "You know, for someone who's allergic to human contact, you sure keep dragging me into your office." He looked up sharply. Rachel stepped closer, her tone softer now. "Why does it bother you so much?" Ethan tensed. "It doesn't." "You're lying." He stood, voice hard. "This conversation is over." But she didn't move. "You weren't disgusted," she said, watching him closely. "When I touched you. You weren't sick. You were scared." He stared at her, silent. "You're scared of me." He turned away. "Don't flatter yourself." "Then why can't you look at me?" Ethan clenched his fists. His reflection in the glass showed a man unraveling. He hated it, hated how fast she'd gotten into his head. She was chaos. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't want order. A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years. But tonight, everything was about to change. Before we jump in, comment your favorite moment so far. Now, let's get into part 3. Ethan Brooks never liked public events. To him, charity galas, fundraising dinners, and luxury auctions were just corporate theater, pointless rituals where people pretended to care while silently measuring bank accounts and social power. But as CEO of Brooks and Lane, his attendance was required. And tonight's event at the Harrington Grand Hotel was no exception. What made it worse? He was expected to bring a date. A high-profile CEO attending alone was one thing. A man with Ethan's reputation for being cold, distant, and famously untouchable? That was an open invitation for gossip. He needed someone professional, someone discreet, someone who wouldn't make things complicated. So naturally, he asked the most complicated person in his life. "Rachel," he said as he stepped out of his office. She looked up from her computer. "Yes, Mr. Brooks?" "There's a charity event tonight. I need a date. You'll accompany me." She blinked. "A date? With you?" "It's not personal. You'll represent the company." Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Let me get this straight. You've spent the past 2 weeks avoiding eye contact, flinching every time I breathe, too close. And now you want me to go out in public with you, dressed up, smiling, like we're normal?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "Yes." She stared at him, searching for a hint of sarcasm. There was none. "I'll be ready at 7, she said, almost amused. "But I'm picking the music on the way there." He didn't reply, which meant she'd already won. At exactly 7 p.m., Rachel stepped into the lobby of her building, dressed in a flowing black gown, subtle jewelry, and soft curls framing her face. Ethan, waiting by the car in a classic tuxedo, looked up and actually froze for a second. Is there a problem? She asked, raising an eyebrow. No, he said, almost too fast. Let's go. The car ride was quiet, tense, but not unpleasant. Rachel watched the city lights through the window, stealing glances at Ethan's profile. He looked like a statue, flawless, unreadable, and entirely composed. Until they arrived. The Harrington Grand shimmered under chandeliers and marble arches. Guests floated through the lobby in designer gowns and tailored suits. Waiters passed flutes of champagne. A string quartet played in the background. Rachel took it all in. So this is where billionaires pretend they care about humanity. They're investors, Ethan said. Same thing. He led her inside, his hand carefully not touching her back. People immediately turned their heads. Whispers rippled through the room. Ethan Brooks brought someone? Then came the moment Rachel hadn't expected. A woman in red approached, tall and poised, with sharp eyes and a too confident smile. Ethan, she said smoothly, didn't expect to see you here, with company. Rachel glanced between them. This is Amelia Crawford, Ethan said flatly. Rachel, my assistant. Amelia, Rachel realized. The ex. Amelia turned to her with a smile that could cut glass. You're very brave. Rachel smiled back sweetly. Well, someone had to put a tie on him the right way. Amelia's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, then she looked back at Ethan. Still pretending you're immune to human contact? I'm not pretending, Ethan replied coolly. Rachel slipped her arm through his, casually, without warning, and smiled. He's better than people think. Just takes the right person to prove it. Ethan's entire body went stiff, but he didn't move away. Amelia's lips tightened. We'll see how long that lasts. She walked off without another word. Rachel slowly removed her hand. Sorry, that felt necessary. Ethan said nothing, but he exhaled slowly, as if calming something inside. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, networking, and too many stares. Rachel played her part flawlessly, poised, witty, effortlessly charming. Ethan noticed everything. The way she diffused awkward conversations with humor. The way she never once tried to draw attention to herself. The way her dress caught the light when she moved. By the time the night ended, they returned to the car in silence. Rachel sank into the seat, kicking off her heels with a sigh. Okay, that was more exhausting than a 12-hour workday. Ethan nodded. You were effective. Effective? She laughed. Wow, so flattering. He glanced at her, then turned his focus back to the road. But the silence was different now. When they reached her building, Rachel paused before stepping out. Thanks for taking me, he nodded. Good night, Rachel. She smiled faintly and closed the door. Ethan waited until she disappeared inside. Then he leaned back in the driver's seat and closed his eyes. His tie was tight. His head was spinning. And all he could think about was the way her arm had felt against his. A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, until one kiss turned his entire world upside down. Before we dive in, leave a comment if you felt the tension building last time. Now, let's continue with part 4. Ethan Brooks didn't sleep that night. He lay in his penthouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling, every moment, from the charity gala, replaying in his head like a looped video. Rachel's laughter, her hand on his arm, the way she faced down Amelia like it was nothing. He didn't understand it. He didn't want to. She had touched him, twice, and he hadn't felt panic or disgust. He had felt grounded. It was dangerous. So the next morning, Ethan returned to the only thing he knew: control. He arrived early, didn't speak unless necessary, and avoided Rachel's desk like it was on fire. If he passed by and heard her voice, he changed direction. If he saw her coming down the hall, he stepped into a side room. Rachel noticed. Of course she did. By noon, Max Caldwell caught on too. He's doing the avoidance shuffle again, Max whispered as Rachel grabbed coffee. What happened? Did you touch his laptop this time? Rachel gave him a tight smile. Worse, I touched a nerve. Max looked amused. I knew something happened at that event. Spill. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't want to talk about the way Ethan had stared at her in the car, or how her heart had nearly pounded out of her chest the whole night. That evening, Ethan was in the elevator when the doors opened, and there she was. Rachel stepped in without hesitation. Silence. Then, so we're doing the silent treatment now? She asked, arms folded. He didn't answer. Great. Very mature. The elevator chimed and opened on their floor. Rachel walked out first, but before she reached her desk, she turned on her heel. No, she said. I'm not doing this. She marched into his office without knocking. Ethan looked up, startled. Rachel! You kissed me with your eyes the entire night. You let me touch you. You didn't flinch. So don't stand there now acting like I'm some kind of emotional landmine. I never said... You didn't have to, she snapped. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You don't understand. Then explain it. I can't. Try. He paused, visibly struggling. I don't know what this is. I don't know what I'm doing with you. I just know I can't think straight when you're near me. Rachel took a slow step forward. Then stop pretending like I don't exist. Ethan stared at her, breathing hard. And then it happened. He reached out and pulled her to him, his hands gripping her waist like he'd been holding back for years, and kissed her. It wasn't cautious or careful. It was immediate, electric, overwhelming. Rachel froze for a heartbeat, then responded, gripping his shirt, returning the kiss with just as much intensity. Every barrier between them collapsed in that moment. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Ethan took a step back. His face shifted, the emotion drained. That was a mistake, he said flatly. Rachel's eyes widened. What? He turned away. It shouldn't have happened. You kissed me, she said, voice shaking. It was impulsive. I lost control. Rachel laughed once, sharp and humorless. Number, don't do that. Don't kiss me like you mean it and then act like I forced it out of you. I don't do relationships. I'm not asking for one. I'm asking for honesty. Ethan didn't reply. His silence was louder than anything else. Rachel stepped back slowly. Got it? She left his office, shutting the door behind her without another word. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of silence. Not comforting, but hollow. That night, Rachel didn't answer his messages. She didn't stop by his office the next morning. She kept everything strictly professional, and it drove him insane. On Friday, he walked into the coffee shop across the street after work, and there she was, with Max, laughing. Max leaned close, said something into her ear, and she laughed again. Ethan clenched his jaw and walked straight over. Rachel, can I talk to you? She blinked. Now? Yes. Max gave her a glance. I'll get us a table. Ethan didn't wait. He pulled her aside. You're on a date? She raised an eyebrow. I didn't realize I needed your permission. You don't. Then why are you here looking like you want to fight someone? He didn't answer. Rachel leaned in just slightly. Are you jealous? No. Then what do you want from me? He stared at her for a second, then did the only thing that made sense in his messed-up world. He kissed her again. This time she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his coat and kissed him back, just as fiercely. And when they broke apart, she didn't say anything. She just smiled. Because now, they both knew, there was no going back. A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years. But now, he couldn't imagine life without her. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, did you think he'd ever admit how he feels? Let's finish the story. For the first time in his life, Ethan Brooks was completely lost. He had spent years building walls, habits, routines, rules, all to protect himself from the chaos of emotion, the risk of connection. But now, those walls had crumbled, and in their place stood a truth too powerful to ignore. He was in love with Rachel Miller. He tried to keep it hidden, tried to maintain professionalism, but it was useless. Every time he walked into the office and saw her not looking at him, it chipped away at his control. She wasn't chasing him anymore, and that hurt more than anything. Rachel, for her part, stayed cool, distant, and painfully polite. No teasing, no jokes, no glances across the hall. She'd given him the message loud and clear. If you want me, come get me. If not, get out of my way. On Friday night, Ethan gave up pretending. He left work early, drove aimlessly for an hour, then parked outside Rachel's apartment building and stared at the glowing windows. He didn't go inside. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he sent a message. Are you happy without me? She never replied. The next morning, he walked into Brooks and Lane wearing jeans and a wrinkled sweater. No tie, no suit, no walls, and in his hand, a massive bouquet of wildflowers. As he stepped off the elevator, every head turned. Phones were lifted, whispers exploded, but he didn't stop. He walked straight across the floor, into the center of the bullpen, and dropped to one knee in front of Rachel's desk. She froze, her eyes wide. Rachel Miller, he said, voice shaking but steady. I was an idiot. Gasps echoed around them. I pushed you away because I was scared. Because I've been scared since the day someone told me I was never enough. But you, he paused, breathing hard. You made me feel again. And I haven't stopped feeling since. Rachel stood slowly, speechless. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black box. He opened it. Inside sat a single, brilliant diamond ring. You made me human again, and now I can't go back. So I'm asking, will you marry me and keep breaking my rules for the rest of our lives? Silence. Then Max, somewhere in the back, whispered, If she says no, I'm quitting. Rachel laughed through her tears. You idiot, she said softly. Then she nodded. Yes, of course, yes. The office erupted into cheers. Ethan stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and kissed her, right there in front of everyone. And no one had ever seen Ethan Brooks smile like that. 3 months later, Rachel stood in front of a mirror in a quiet dressing room, wearing a sleek, white gown with pearl buttons and a soft veil. Her hands were shaking. Max peeked in. You ready? Rachel smiled. More than ever. Downstairs, Ethan waited at the altar, looking like he was about to face a boardroom full of billionaires. But the moment he saw her walk through the doors, everything melted away. She was everything he had ever feared and everything he'd never believed he could have. The ceremony was quiet, simple, beautiful. When the officiant said, You may kiss the bride, Ethan leaned in with the kind of certainty he had never allowed himself to feel before. They kissed, and the whole room clapped like they'd been holding their breath for years. Later that night, as fireworks lit up the sky over the city, Ethan held Rachel in his arms on the balcony of their hotel suite. I never thought I'd be able to have this, he whispered. Rachel looked up at him. Have what? This. You. She smiled, resting her head against his chest. Well, get used to it, because I'm never letting you run again. He laughed softly, and this time it wasn't guarded or restrained. This time it was real. Because Ethan Brooks wasn't running anymore. He was finally home.